My name's Steve Maher, and welcome to our RMP webinar this morning. Before we get started, we'll be focusing on the EPA's RMP Modernization and Expansion Program, talking about the request for information, due dates, how to respond. I'll also be providing a bunch of background information and a number of tips on what do you do right now with these things on the horizon, but probably on the far horizon. But first, before we get into that, let me talk a little bit about logistics. The key things that we're going to be, the key speakers today will be myself, Steve Maher, and also Jordan Schultz of Risk Management Professionals. Our producers, Michael Vigliarolo and also Tim Lee, will be in the background trying to keep our electronics operational and fully functional so that you can have a webinar that you can enjoy. What you see on the screen is a video image of the speaker and also a PowerPoint presentation. Everything is being recorded, so it will be downloadable later. You'll be hearing the audio and you'll be seeing the PowerPoint presentations. That's the part that will actually be recorded. So let me talk a little bit about what we're doing. We're using a GoToWebinar interface. You've got a little box on your screen that has the speaker and a larger box that has the PowerPoint presentation. Those sizes are adjustable. If you grab the interface point between the two boxes, you can adjust it to whatever looks best on your device that you're listening to. We also have a box for questions. If questions come up during the presentation, and also I've got two daughters, so I'm not immune. I'm no stranger to criticism. So basically, if you have some concerns about what I'm speaking about or some additional points to make, you're welcome to put some information in the questions box, and during the presentation you can make interjections. After the presentation we will be doing a question-answer session, and you can pose questions that way. We also in the upper left-hand corner have a little box that I believe says webcam. So you can use that as a pull-down, and you can adjust the position of where you want to see the speaker. I suspect you can also turn me off too, which may be your preference. But anyhow, let's go ahead and get started. Like I mentioned, this is part of our outreach program. We do a lot of risk management program, process safety management program, and SEMS program development for folks. A lot of people call us for expertise in HAZUP studies, LOPA, and all the various hazard identification techniques, which a lot of people like to task out because they like to see the job getting done, and it tends to be a core competency for us. We also get involved in risk graphs, quantitative risk assessment, bow ties, and all these various things. And our main objective here is to try to share some of those insights from having been doing this for an extended period of time, so that you can manage your programs and also deal with some of these evolving regulations. So let's go to the next one. So commercial's over. So let's get started with our key topics here. I'll be speaking about where we're at right now with the current regulations that provides a baseline for where things are going to be moving. Talk about the modernization programs, and then Jordan will be focusing on the specific elements in the EPA's current request for information, and then we'll both be handling the QA session. And as appropriate, if the questions come up that require a little bit of research, we'll have some other folks join us that can hopefully help out. So let's talk about where we're at right now. This particular slide that you're looking at gives me it's a benchmark for me for a couple of things. First of all, I started my career in the 80s. I was doing PHAs in 1983, and then in 1984 with the Bhopal, India tragedy, it really emphasized the importance of this kind of work. All these things, all these tragedies have happened, all the accidents, all the near misses, really emphasizes the importance of the work that safety professionals in this field do. And I think that's probably most of our audience right now, is people who are trying their best to manage programs at plant sites and also make sure that hazards are identified and managed before they cause serious accidents that can hurt people. When you've looked at these major accidents before, in the very distant past, people tend to focus on blame the engineer, blame the operator, whatever. Well, what came out of that is really people took a look in the mirror, and industry did respond first and really said, well, what's the real core of how we can improve things? And the real focus became realizing that these are fairly simple precursors to these events, that the root causes were failure to maintain the design intent, and it was really by addressing safety culture and management systems that was the key to solving the problem. This particular slide to me illustrates a couple of key points in terms of how we got to where we're at today. As I mentioned before, I was doing PHAs. I didn't start doing HAZOP studies until 1986, but I was doing PHAs in 83 when Bhopal hit, and it really woke industry up, and it certainly got my attention to the importance of the work that we did. The first groups to respond and really address some of these safety culture issues were industry. The Center for Chemical Process Safety was formed shortly after the Bhopal event. I had the privilege of serving on the technical steering committee for a bit during the early days. API recommended practice 750 coming out in 1990. All these kind of emphasized the industry's feeling that they had a responsibility and importance to do this. When you look at the evolution in the United States for onshore process safety, 750 was adopted. Most of the elements were adopted, a few additional ones and some other nuances by the EPA and OSHA to really come up with the RMP and PSM regulations, and that became the baseline for onshore process safety. Offshore, it was really the Piper Alpha tragedy that really brought up the importance of offshore safety and early safety environmental management programs. That initiative was done by industry, and it was later evolved into what you see currently as safety and environmental management systems that's administered by BSEE. Outside the United States, again, Piper Alpha triggered an awakening of the importance of offshore safety, and safety cases came about. Safety cases apply to both onshore and offshore facilities, but a lot of the key emphasis in the early days was offshore. The really interesting thing about this is when you look at it, it really reflects human nature in a couple of different levels. People tend to be reactionary. They tend to respond to major tragedies and then start putting together programs to address them. And also things do tend to be regionalized. When it happens in your backyard, it tends to get people's attention more, and people do tend to have that focus. But when you look at whether you're looking at onshore process safety, offshore safety management systems in the U.S. or outside the United States, basically all of them evolved in parallel to really reach the same endpoint. When you look at the core of the management systems and safety cases, when you look at safety and environmental management systems programs, when you look at PSM, when you look at RMP, all of them have very similar elements that are all meant to try to manage the degree of safety at plant sites. So that parallel evolution, reaching the same, a very similar endpoint, really reflects how successful these kind of programs are. Also, when you're looking at the permanence of some of these elements, what you're seeing is a historical look at the 1990 elements from API Recommended Practice 750. You're looking at process safety information, process hazards analysis, management of change, operating procedures. All those things should be very familiar to you, whether you're doing safety cases, SIMs, PSM, or RMP, as core elements for how do you manage safety. So that recognition 24 years ago of the importance of these elements still is pertinent today in current programs. And when you look at a lot of the key programs in the United States, whether you're looking at offshore, whether you're looking at onshore, whether you're looking from the perspective of OSHA of protecting plant personnel, or the perspective of the EPA if you're protecting off-site individuals, a lot of these core elements that you see in green on your screen are nearly identical. So the things that work to prevent accidents, when they're properly applied and when they're properly enforced and there's a baseline of regulatory continuity, all those things are a success strategy for managing safety at plant sites. And so that's where we're at right now. And this slide that I'm just showing right now kind of is just a reference slide that shows the different citations in the different regulatory programs. That's for reference. I'm not going to go over that further. But where we've evolved and the point we're at right now is a number of different programs for different types of facilities. But whether you're dealing with offshore, onshore, in the U.S., outside the U.S., whether you're dealing with an ammonia refrigeration system or whether you're dealing with a refinery. The same types of approaches over a wide spectrum of different types of facilities and also a different industries and locations, they work. And they've really been the core of what's been going on. But let's talk about where things are going. Obviously, nothing's ever static, and a lot of these have been in place for a couple of decades, so it's fair for folks to be taking a second look at things and really always questioning, can we do better? And I think that's the basis for the current modernization programs. What you've got right now, Executive Order 13650 that came up in August 2013 from the U.S. White House basically was an impetus to push forth on chemical facility safety and security. And it was in response to a couple of different things. From a technical nature, there was a release and fire that didn't cause any immediate injuries on site from a refinery in Northern California on August 6, 2012, that brought up some technical questions of how well things are being regulated and how well are some of these process safety elements being applied. Also separately, in the city of West Texas in 2013, there was a terrible tragedy involving ammonium nitrate that certainly got a lot of folks' attention to, here there might be some gaps in the regulatory environment and a need to take a second look at that. So those kind of things moved forth the executive order for chemical facility safety and security. And as part of that order, there was a mandate for the different agencies to work together to try to formulate improvements in their programs. And of course, with the mandate to work together, the initial reaction for all the agencies was to launch independent investigations. And so what we've got right now are different modernization efforts that are being looked at. The key ones in the United States at the federal level are being pushed forth by the EPA, OSHA, and also the Chemical Safety Board. In California, there's an interagency working group for refineries, and there's also the Office of Emergency Services. These are the ones on the right. All of them have been taking an independent look at the regulatory environment and coming up with different regulations, or different proposed regulations. That's where we're at right now. We're in the proposals. We're in the proposed regulatory stage, and our purpose here today is to address where are we at and where is it going and what do you do in the meantime. So that upper right-hand corner that I didn't go through in the previous timeline slide, I've expanded to show the different agencies and what's been happening so you can get a pretty good picture of how things are progressing. When you're looking at EPA and OSHA, which are probably going to have the biggest impacts through their risk management program and process safety management program regulations on facilities in the United States, OSHA came up late last year with its request for information. Basically, for those of you who are not familiar with that, a request for information is the regulatory process where the different agencies have proposed changes to the regulations and they're requesting feedback. So the process for both OSHA and the EPA was to say, hey, we're thinking of changing certain things. What do you guys think? For OSHA, comments were due at the end of March 2014. Risk management professionals provided feedback on 2 of the items, and there were a number of other industry groups that also provided feedback. In parallel, the EPA has been taking a fresh look at its risk management program requirements, and just recently on July 31st, published in the Federal Register, its proposed, in some cases proposed changes, and in other cases really more questions in terms of, hey, what do you guys think, the community and industry, about the viability of these regulations and what happens with that. So that's just come out, and that's really the basis for why we're doing this webinar. There's a number of different changes that are being proposed in there that people should be aware of for 2 reasons. There is an importance for providing feedback to the EPA so that they can hone their regulations to really maximize their effectiveness and not be focused on things that aren't very important. There's also so there's a need to provide that feedback to the EPA, and also it's important that people are aware of what might be coming up. And one of the things that we want to do today is provide you with some little tips on what you can do in the meantime to kind of buffer the things that are likely to be changed. So this request for information, the EPA's Federal Register document is quite voluminous. the request for information is due on October 29th. So if you want to have your feedback, if you want to be heard, if you want to have some feedback, you'll want to go ahead and be part of the process that feeds information back to the EPA so they can fine-tune their regulations. By the way, before I forget, in the lower right-hand corner of this slide is a URL, a link to one of the pages that we keep up. It's on our rmpcorp.com website. It's called SMS Regulatory Updates with underscores in between them. And what we've done is try to keep up with these things as they're evolving, and also some links to where you get the regulations, where you get the request for information, the Federal Register copies, etc. So that I use it all the time just so that I can keep up with what's going on, and we're trying to keep that up to date so that people can follow these changes pretty well. So EPA and OSHA are going to form a mainstream of the actual regulatory changes that people are going to have to address. So let's talk about the second timeline here. One of the agencies that a lot of people don't see as much is the Chemical Safety Board. It's a federal agency. It's in charge of really investigating accidents and providing technical feedback to the other agencies that actually regulate and enforce these safety programs at plant sites. The CSB came up with an initial report after the August 6, 2012 refinery event, and in April 2013 they came up with an initial report that had a lot of recommendations that were focused on improvements to process hazard analysis. You notice that's first in our timeline. The CSB was very responsive. They came up with a technical report. The core focus was PHAs, and they came up with a number of ideas to improve how those are being implemented. And realistically, those improvements are really the core of what a lot of the changes are that EPA and OSHA is proposing. So the work that CSB is doing is very important, and it really feeds into this. So you want to pay a lot of attention to that. Also, the CSB's initial recommendations from 2013, although sometimes they looked rather ominous, there are simple ways of addressing that, and that's some of the tips that we've been sharing in our webinar series, and we'll go over a few of them today. As I mentioned, in August 2013, there was Executive Order 13650. There have been some public meetings that the CSB has done, and they've also issued in May, I believe it was May 1st of 2014, a draft regulatory report. That's the second timeline on the right-hand side. That regulatory report was really addressing the accident that occurred in 2012, but really looking at it from a regulatory framework. What went wrong with respect to the enforcement, with respect to the regulatory community and their coverage? How well did they do? What are the gaps, and how do we address that? And we'll be talking about that shortly. Also, the bottom timeline, there's a couple of other agencies involved. As I mentioned, in California, there's an interagency working group. They came up with a report in February of 2014. I'll be going over those key items shortly. A lot of those also springboarded from the CSB's recommendations. And also, there's a state accidental release prevention program in California called CalARP. The Office of Emergency Services is dealing with changes and updates to that. So this is where we're at. This is what's happening. And so what I want to do for the rest of my time on podium, is really kind of identify some of the key points in there and some tips for addressing that. First one, as I mentioned, the CSB has been a real driver for a lot of the proposed technical changes. And so I wanted to go ahead and go over the categories of recommendations from their April 17, 2013 interim investigation report. The important thing to note here, and it's right at the top title of this slide, is that they're, as of August 2014, that's now, their investigation status is listed as ongoing. So this is not a closed issue as far as the CSB is concerned. These reports will be finalized, recommendations followed through, etc. Also, let me skip to the last bullet on this before I go any further. We have, as I mentioned, we've been doing a webinar series as these evolve. Risk management professionals, this is what we do. We go out and help people develop programs, and a core effort for ours is process hazard analysis. So we do these webinars a lot to kind of share some of our insights and things that we do. We also do regional seminars. We did one in Oxnard, California on the 24th of April 2014, earlier this year, where we recorded that. and we've made those all the webinars and recordings are available on our website, and that has a lot of tips on how to address the OSHA issues. I'm just going to go ahead and just overview them today. Also on June 17th, we did a webinar that really looked at the state of PHA and provided a lot of tips on minor changes that you can make to your PHAs to really address the bulk of what we consider the bulk of what we see coming up. Again, a lot of it's speculative until the regulations are finalized, but we feel there are simple things that you can do now to really address the spirit of what's being done and buffer any changes that you might have to make in the future. My objective when I have risk management professional staff in the field doing HAZOP studies and helping people with LOPA is really to provide work products that will stand the test of these evolving requirements, and once these requirements come out, we're trying to do simple things so that people don't have to redo everything. All right, so anyhow, let's talk about what the categories are for the CSB report. One of the key categories is safeguards and their effectiveness. We talked about some simple tips in this June 17th webinar, things like challenging the team when you're a HAZOP study facilitator to make sure that the safeguards are reliable and effective for those scenarios. We also put transmitters specifically identified in the initiating event, and also in the safeguards, so if there are any common mode failures, those are addressed. We also apply LOPA and risk graphs selectively to help put those things in perspective. And also when you look at safeguards and their effectiveness, when you're dealing with operator response to alarms, is the operator in a location to hear the alarm? Is the alarm clear? Do they have to get permissions to do anything? How long does it take them to diagnose? And once they take corrective action, does it have time to take effect and actually mitigate the event? These kind of things are simple things that you can do during a PHA to really challenge these safeguards and their effectiveness. And there's more information in our webinar, but the point is there are simple things that can be done to really make this overall regulatory evolution a lot easier on you at your plant site. Inherently safer systems requirements, that was a core element of the CSB. Well, the CSB's report, well, the CSB on www.csb.gov has a checklist that really addresses a lot of the inherently safer systems requirements. Applying that checklist during the PHA, nothing during a PHA is a lot of fun, but it's not all that painful, and it really can get the spirit of what is being proposed here taken care of. Damage mechanism hazard reviews, sounds scary, there's still no industry guidance, but basically there are simple ways of addressing the kind of issues associated with mechanical integrity that were criticized by the CSB with reference to that refinery event that I mentioned. What we do during our PHAs is for any events that can challenge temperature or pressure limits on equipment or piping, we'll go back and double check the design limits for that equipment or piping. Make sure we look at piping specs. When we're finished with a certain node, we'll have a little mini checklist that we have the team go through. We put in the general category, and then when we're done with at the very end of the PHA, we have a special node for damage mechanisms and hazard reviews that we make sure gets reviewed for a lot of the key characteristics. Again, very simple things that may take a little bit extra time, but it's not that much, and it really addresses the spirit of what's being done here. So a lot of these things, although they sound very ominous, can really be addressed pretty readily. And as I mentioned, the CSB has come up with a regulatory report. The key focus of that, and I'm sure a lot of you have, if you've watched the video of the hearings in January up in Northern California, if you've been watching a lot of the documentation, or if you read the regulatory report, you'll see that there's been a lot of mention of something called a safety case recently. The safety change in the regulatory regime is something that the CSB has been pushing for because of criticisms about it not providing the enforcement levels and coverage levels that were appropriate for maintaining the level of safety at a lot of facilities. With these criticisms, they took a fresh look at safety case, and a lot of what's being proposed right now that can have a fairly big impact on facilities is a shift to a safety case regime. So they've taken a fresh look at it, and this is what they're proposing as one way to fill the gaps with respect to regulatory involvement and also enforcement. And also having regulatory agencies monitor leading and lagging process safety indicators, basically applying some metrics so they can have a concerted look about how well the facilities are doing and are they going off course with respect to process safety. So again, the CSB has taken a look at the regulatory regimes in general, and in May 1st of this year came up with a report that said, hey, we should be taking a fresh look at this, and here's one thing that's being addressed elsewhere in the world that they're recommending be evaluated for application in the United States. And we'll be talking more about safety cases later, because those definitely have the potential to be a rather large impact, and there's a lot of criticisms out there about how effective they are too. So a lot of these things are in play and being evaluated. The California Interagency Working Group, their Refinery Task Force, I've put a reference to their report here. They're establishing the task force. They're looking at emergency response and preparedness, a lot of things that agencies are supposed to be doing. And then they're also looking at buffering the CalARP and PSM program refinery requirements in California only. That's the focus of this agency, but a lot of these will look familiar to you. They want to look at inherently safer systems issues, safety culture, damage mechanism hazard reviews, buffering root cause analysis, and also accounting for human factors. And also ensuring safeguards in the process hazards analysis are appropriate and effective. So a lot of that sounds really familiar, but I mentioned some tips on a few of these. There's some easy ways to look at root cause analysis. There are mechanisms, analysis tools such as Taproot. I've taught courses in the past on root cause analysis. There's lots of different mechanisms out there for doing that. It doesn't have to be applied universally. You can have in your incident investigation procedure an assessment, have we identified the root causes, and do we need to analyze things further? So you can kind of take a reflective look as part of your incident investigation process and really address the spirit of, do you need a specific root cause analysis, and selectively apply it. When you're looking at human factors issues, challenging the use of operator response to alarms during the HAZUP study. That's one thing that needs to be addressed. It's really pretty straightforward. It just means your facilitator is going to have to be sensitized to that and ask rather probing and pointed questions during the HAZUP study. Other human factors issues that have come up recently are changes to the organization. Well, that sounds pretty ominous, because organizations are a dynamic animal. You're always changing personnel out, they're changing roles, you've got new people involved. Well, that can get really complicated, and if you take it to its full extent, it can be very ominous. But the reality is there are simple ways of addressing that too. When you're doing your annual PSM refresher training to your personnel, most refresher trainings, they go over the elements for about an hour, and then they spend some time going over management of change, because management of change is really something that everybody needs to be engaged in. Well, as part of your MOC process and as part of this PSM refresher training, it's pretty easy to tell people that if you're aware of organizational changes where you've got new people, changes in experience, even changes in personality that can have a difference in empowering the organization to apply process safety events, just as they are empowered to identify physical or operational changes at the plant site, they can be empowered to identify if there's some organizational issues that need to be looked at too. And that can help focus a lot of the issues that are being brought up with respect to accounting for human factors. Also, as part of this interagency working group, they want to buffer the CalARP program requirements. And for refineries, and again, a lot of the focus is on refineries for reasons I've mentioned before, they want facilities to do annual compliance audits. They want increased frequency of agency inspections, and they want an independent evaluation of each refinery's risk management plan. Well, that is a lot of extra work to be doing all this. But if you structure your program properly, a lot of people are doing rotating audits on different program elements, and a lot of people do look at various safety management programs and their implementation at plant sites. So a lot of that, it can be done with a smart repackaging of what you may already be doing at your refinery. The COOP inspections, you're going to have to leave that up to the agency. The independent evaluation of the risk management plan, I'm not so sure where that's going. If that comes up, and if it's a regulatory requirement, you're not going to have much choice other than to comply. But there's a lot of things you can do to minimize the impact of what might come out of that. Again, like I mentioned, the interagency working group is composed of agencies by definition, and there's the enforcement capability, what they're doing with the community education and alerts, and also where they might be going with the regulatory environment. Their monitoring of leading and lagging indicators, safety cases, etc., is something that they've recommended for further study. Again, the safety case thing came up again. A lot of people are looking at as they're looking at that as a mechanism to fill current gaps. But I think the real key question, and this is a question that came up with some of the hearings, is it needed to fill the gaps, or are there other ways to do it? And that's also being looked at with a lot of feedback from industry. So let's also, what I want to do is take a couple minutes and go over OSHA's 17 requests for information topics. The response was due at the end of March. We did go over this in our Oxnard seminar and in our recent webinar. What I wanted to do is just identify them quickly so you can see the correlation to what Jordan's going to talk about with respect to risk management programs. So I've just simply listed them out. Some of them, like the first three with respect to atmospheric storage tank exemption and what to do about wells and production facilities, are something that really the OSHA needs to address with respect to program applicability to sites that they consider important. Those were proposed. They did get their feedback. They'll be digesting that and deciding what they want to do to the process safety management program. Item number 4, reactivity hazards. That's also being looked at for risk management programs, and I've provided the citation to the July 31st, that's in red, the July 31st request for information that came out. So reactivity hazards are something that OSHA and the EPA are both looking at. Updating the list of hazardous chemicals, they're both looking at what chemicals are applicable. Item number 6, the risk-based process safety and additional management system elements. Metrics and measurement mechanisms are things that have been mentioned quite a bit. That's something that both OSHA and the EPA are doing. Although there's going to be a lot of changes there and there's going to be a need to apply numbers, it's also not a panacea that will solve all problems. Recognize that any metrics that you come up with are going to have a certain level of subjectivity associated with that, no matter how objective you want to make them. One of the things that we do during our audits is we offer it as an option to our clients when we do compliance audits to actually go through and apply some basic metrics so that they can go ahead and start applying them, looking at how well they apply to their plant sites, and really addressing the spirit of what's coming up in several different regulatory fronts here. Also, Bessie has come up with, as part of their SEMS program, stop work authority, ultimate work authority, and employee participation plans that are being required. This was also something that OSHA is looking at. Again, these aren't all that difficult. A lot of facilities, whether they're specifically part of SEMS, by the way, is offshore. If you're a plant manager, you want people out there who are engaged, looking around, and will stop work if there's something that's done unsafe, that's not safe. So when I go to plant sites, I often see this in the visitor briefing, in contractor briefings and whatnot. These are things that a lot of people want to do right now. It's easy. You can go ahead and roll that into your program and really buffer what this will do for you, to you, if and when OSHA invokes this part of their proposed regulations. Recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices, RAG-A-REP, it's pretty basic. OSHA's proposing it, EPA's proposing it, you've got the citation. Mechanical integrity of safety critical equipment, both OSHA and EPA. This is something that's also fairly easy to address. When you're doing a HAZOP study and you've identified safeguards that are important to the process and important to protecting you from certain scenarios, that's a good focal point for a lot of key safety critical equipment. So these are easy things that you can start doing now that are consistent with best practices, and when these proposed OSHA regulations come about, you're basically most of the way there with respect to addressing them. Management and organizational changes, we talked about that. that's coming up in a lot of different regulatory frameworks that is being proposed, and I provided the RMP citation here, coordination with emergency planning and local emergency response authorities. That's kind of a best practice right now. If you want to protect your personnel and if you want to protect your facility, having some sort of interface so that your local responders know you're there, know what the chemicals are, and you can get help when you need it. It's pretty important, even if it's something as basic as a physical issue with an employee. There was one facility that I worked at. They had had somebody with a mild heart attack. He did fine, but it took a long time to get a responder out there because the local response agency, there was a discontinuity with respect to the facility address and what showed up on their GPS. So it took them a while to get out there. So whether you're looking at rather mundane physical hazards, well, I'm sure it wasn't mundane to the guy who had the heart attack, but whether you're looking at those kind of things or you're looking at major process plant accidents, interfacing with your local planning authority, it makes sense, it's easy to do, and also it'll buffer any changes that OSHA comes up with. Third-party compliance audits, I don't know where that's going. We went ahead and commented on that in our response to the OSHA RFI back in March. The EPA is also pushing that, and I've identified that citation in red. Additional coverage for explosives, blasting agents, and pyrotechnics, and also updating other parts of OSHA's regulation. The pyrotechnics and explosives are things that EPA is also looking at for obvious reasons after the West Texas tragedy. And then citation 106 and 107 in the OSHA regs is strictly OSHA's business. Storage and handling and management of ammonium nitrate, that was an obvious addition. That's in OSHA's RFI and proposed regulations as well as the EPA's. PSM exemptions for retail facilities, both OSHA and EPA want to go ahead and narrow that a little bit, and I provided the EPA citation. And then of course, what do you do for highly hazardous chemicals without specific concentration thresholds? The chemicals that are identified and the concentration thresholds are things that EPA and OSHA are both looking at. So those are the key things that OSHA was doing, the Interagency Working Group in California for refineries, and also the CSB are doing. You see a lot of overlap. You see a lot of movement in directions that are going to provide some fundamental changes to the regulations and how people deal with PSM and RMP issues. But as I've tried to share with you, there are simple things that you can be doing right now to really buffer that impact when it does come about. So right now what I'd like to do is shift the focus to the specific task at hand, which is what's in the RFI from the July 31st Federal Register that applies to RMP, what are the proposed regulations, and what are their impacts at your facility. So I'm going to turn it over to Jordan Schultz and let him talk about that for a bit, and we'll have question and answer session afterwards.
All right, as Steve said, I'm Jordan Schultz with Risk Management Professionals, and I'll be speaking about the RMP specific modernization efforts with the RFI. All right, there were 12 unique topics to the RFI. They're drawn from the CCPS, CSB, also the executive order, and some lessons that have been learned since the last updates. Focus, updating the program to be more aligned with the goals of EPA. You'll see a lot of effort put on making sure that off-site releases are looked at. There's a little bit more with worker safety, and it kind of came away from that. Implementing new technology to make sure that you're proactive against releases, and increasing involvement and oversight to ensure that you're compliant. So the first topic is safer technology and alternatives analysis. They're basing this in the general duty clause, which currently says trying to substitute less hazardous substances for extremely hazardous substances or minimizing inventories. They've gone ahead and said, essentially, you can also make the process more safe rather than just looking at the chemicals by making some simple or more complex changes to the actual process. And this was petitioned in July of 2012 by both groups and individuals to implement inherently safer technology assessments. The CCPS and New Jersey with the TCPA have already gone ahead and made guidance and a checklist for IST analysis. One thing they do suggest is maybe just implementing this as part of your PHA. As Steve said, this might be a little bit easier than going ahead and bringing in the expertise for two separate events. And one thing they also do bring up is you got to make sure that when you're evaluating it, you're looking at the whole process. Basically, you can fix one hazard but make it much more hazardous in a different area. Essentially, if you change your chemical but you have to raise your temperature, you could be looking at different issues. Instead of making it safer, you've just changed your hazard. And what they're seeking comments on is, should this be a separate element, or should they just go ahead and include this as part of the PHA? How should they regulate these items? Obviously, with something like IST, you're going to be running into a lot of gray area, and it's going to be very difficult to enforce some of the options. And should all facilities be required to look into IST, or just what they consider high-risk facilities, such as petroleum? Number 2 would be emergency drills to test your emergency response plan. Subpart E requires the coordinated response with LEPCs and response agencies. Other programs that require periodic drilling that they go ahead and reference, the Oil Pollution Prevention Act and the NRC also does require these sorts of things. CCPS also recommends periodic testing. Just this ensures that personnel are trained, know their roles, and responders know what they're going to be doing with the unique hazards. And also it ties back to what Steve was talking about, in that if you have your responders going ahead and coming out, even if you have something that's not necessarily a catastrophic release, they'll know how to go ahead and get around the facility. They'll be familiar with it. So your response times, even if it is something just health related like heat stroke or a mild heart attack, emergency response personnel will be able to get there effectively. And one thing they're looking at comments for is, should these be internal or external? So essentially, should you just be drilling your employees, or should you make sure that these have, say, your local response, and then these are coordinated, making sure that both parties know exactly what their roles are? Number 3, automated detection and monitoring. EPA notes that engineering and administrative controls should be reviewed during the PHA. However, with these sorts of things, you can run into failures even if you are going ahead. Your mechanical integrity program is good. You're making sure that everything is being maintained like it should be. There still are failures. And they're seeing if using area monitors or detectors, as well as your automation in the process that would indicate a process upset, should be required. And recognize that this might not be possible for all processes or chemicals, and there may not be well-documented industry standards on how to do some of these things. And also, with regards to area monitoring, they recognize also this can be extremely expensive and pretty difficult to maintain. So they're seeing what the cost-benefit analysis is, as well as the feasibility for some facilities. And it expands the requirement for automation to supplement the PHA or ERP. So what they're looking for, should the public or emergency responders be automatically notified? And if they are, what about false alarms? They recognize that just like the automation, you can also have failures with these monitoring systems. You don't want a false alarm triggering shelter in place or everyone coming out in hazmat gear just because there was a trip. And what about remote or unmanned facilities? If the tree falls in the woods kind of thing. So 4, additional stationary source requirements. They're considering more site-specific requirements on stationary source siting. Considering requiring a buffer or setback zone for new sources. Essentially, they recognize that a lot of times communities are built nearby their chemical facilities. It may not be feasible right now to go ahead and require a buffer zone, as these are private residences. However, with new facilities, this should be looked at, making sure that there is adequate space between the public and a potential hazard. Obviously, this has been learned from Bhopal and West Texas. These areas have been, very built up against the process itself. Tragedy occurs, and then there is a big public event. And then also on-site, with the Texas City Refinery, there were a lot of portable stations, a lot of buildings that were put in during some of the turnaround events. And obviously, when there were issues, these were directly affected. And API 752, which deals with the location of process plant buildings, and 753, which talks about the portable buildings, are good regulatory things to look at. CCPS also has facility siting and also looking at the explosions and toxic risk for process buildings. The EPA is looking for comments. What guidance should be used? Like I said, there's CCPS and API have both released documents on this. What about facilities with limited space? If you're in a very highly residential area, or if you're in, say, an urban environment, feasibly it may be very difficult to go ahead and try and make sure you have a buffer zone. So what else can be done? Also, should these zones be changed? Obviously, some chemicals are more hazardous than others. However, if you have certain buffer zone requirements, how could these be affected and how could these be changed to make sure it's reflective of the chemical? And what safeguards should be incorporated into the siting requirements? On 5, compliance with ERP requirements with local responders. EPA notes that non-responding facilities often do not fully comply with requirements for non-responder facilities. Source facility in the community emergency response plan is supposed to be required, coordinated with the local fire department. Also, appropriate notification mechanisms are supposed to be in place to notify emergency responders of their release. However, they've noticed that, like I said, when they've gone ahead and audited facilities, that a lot of times they aren't included in this community response program, or the notification system is flawed. There have been issues where essentially faulty incident command systems have led to delayed responses, shelter in place wasn't quickly established, and then obviously there are a lot of risks to the public if these things aren't in an emergency response done quickly and effectively. So EPA, what they're looking at, would more stringent enforcement lead to better compliance? Are there particularly challenging facilities for emergency agencies? And with regards to that, what if those local response units aren't capable of responding to this? Should the facility be responsible for providing these capabilities? Should they have maybe a mutual aid agreement? Making sure that a lot of these things are looked at. Number 6, incident investigation and accident history requirements. They want to look at investigating all accidental releases and also near misses. Currently, they're only required to report catastrophic or near catastrophic releases. EPA has encouraged near misses and just small releases. However, as it's not required, a lot of facilities do not do this. Obviously, if you're not investigating near misses, you can run into quite a few issues. Essentially, if you're not looking at why this happened, there's a pretty good chance it's going to happen again. And also, there are issues that the industry does learn from your incidents. So say your facility has a problem, the same thing could happen down the road and then could end up with that catastrophic situation. Also, they're considering implementing a 6-month requirement for reporting these incidents. So what they're looking at is the incident investigation process too narrowly focused? Is it looking at only the catastrophic releases too focused? What time frame should completion for investigations, how's that going to yield the best results? And should an incident automatically trigger a compliance audit? Is another thing that they did propose. Number 7, worst case scenario quantity requirements for numerous small vessels. Current requirements involve the largest amount in a single vessel or pipe. Obviously, there are a lot of facilities that have very small but tightly quartered flammable or toxic chemicals. And looking at, say, a propane bullet versus multiple ones that are all nearby, you're going to run into a very different scenario, and they're thinking this isn't indicative of the actual hazard at hand. In St. Louis, there was an issue where a lot of small propane containers caught fire on one, and then this obviously cascaded into nearly the entire plant going up and a pretty solid effect on the community. So with regards to that, how should this be calculated? You know, should they look at doing vessels that are grouped in the pallets or racks? Should you just look at going ahead and saying, okay, this is how much we'll have stored in these small containers. Here's the entire sum of it. And should you also look at interconnected equipment or processes? This also includes if you're connected by pipeline to another facility or location, should you possibly be looking at what if this goes ahead and propagates through? So what they're looking at, would this approach be better representation of a worst case scenario? Should some of the physical barriers to mitigate potential cascading releases be taken into account? And if interconnected facilities are required to be examined for cascading failure effects, does this affect confidentiality or security? Number 8, public disclosure of information to promote compliance and public understanding. They just want to look at, you can look at some of this stuff through RTK. However, would it be better if they go ahead and disclose additional information, say the executive summary, emergency contact information, your EPCRA Tier 2s, summary of PHA, compliance audit, and incident investigations turned over. So obviously what they're looking at, would this compromise security or potential proprietary information? And should the company just go ahead and be required to publish this on their own rather than having to go through EPA or other websites? Number 9, changes to threshold quantities and endpoints for OCAs. They're considering using the acute exposure guideline levels to calculate the threshold quantities and endpoints. Changes in this threshold will not be uniform. Obviously, some of these will increase, some of them will decrease, and this will affect your total endpoint distance. Right now, they're based off of the IDLH. There are some flaws in using IDLH for the RMP. It's good for OSHA in that it is based on healthy working male populations, not the general public. However, obviously this isn't indicative of an off-site consequence. You're not going to be just looking at a healthy working male population, but you'll have children, elderly, people that will be much more susceptible to chemical releases. It's also based on a 30-minute exposure, which can underestimate the actual exposures. And does not account for serious but reversible health term effects. So this is looking at purely this could kill somebody. However, you're obviously going to be having different responses. Things can be reversible. However, when it's the public, this obviously also is not acceptable. So like I said, acute exposure guideline levels are being examined because they are based on the general population. These facts and figures would be much more holistic. They're going to look at the entire population that would be susceptible to this. They've also been developed for 10 minutes, 30 minutes, hour, 4 hours, and 8 hours. And currently there are 471 chemicals. And they did note that they're going to use the emergency response plan guidelines for other chemicals that aren't currently represented through the acute exposure guideline levels. Many toxic endpoints will be lower. Unfortunately, this is going to result in further endpoint distances. This could decrease enrollment in program 1s. And what they're looking at, with longer acute exposure guideline levels, say 8 hours, be incorporated in the alternative release scenario or worst case scenarios. What if there isn't the acute exposure guideline levels or the emergency response planning guideline levels available? What would you use? Would you stay with the IDLH? Program 3 NAICS codes changed due to RMP accident history data. Essentially, I've gone and broken it up into a table. Currently, these are the NAICS codes that are automatically Program 3. However, they've noted that the most accidents don't necessarily occur at the ones that you would think. Say your plastics facilities. It's actually things like, say, your water supply and irrigation systems. So they're looking at, would it be better to go ahead and base these off of that? However, it's just the statistic. Should you look at how many facilities there are? What are the severity of these incidents? There are a lot of factors that need to go into it when you're just saying these are the top 10 most dangerous NAICS codes. 11, the safety case regulatory model. This has obviously been a really big buzzword lately. Safety case is a regulated high-risk industries must demonstrate to the regulator that risks are as low as reasonably practicable, or ALARP. Steve's mentioned it, but we have additional information on safety case. It's at the link below. This has been recommended by the CSB after Chevron Richmond. The executive order also wanted to explore the safety case, and it has popped up in the RFI for EPA RMP. So they have recognized that this would take a substantial amount of effort and proposes maybe just as a starting point requiring EPA approval of your PHA. They also propose requiring safety case for selected categories, say petroleum refineries instead of the entire EPA RMP eligible facilities. So EPA is seeking comments on the advantages and disadvantages of the safety case compared to current regulations. What additional resources would be required to implement the safety case? They quote the NRC. They currently have about 100 reactors and about 3,000 other facilities that they're regulating, and they operate at a budget of about $1 billion annually. So obviously with EPA, they have quite a few more facilities. What would be the increase in cost from what they currently run at? And is this suitable for all RMP covered facilities? Like I said, there are higher risks in, say, refineries than some of the other facilities. Would it be more appropriate just to regulate a safety case at these high-risk facilities? And the 12th, it's just streamlining RMP requirements. They're looking for comments on ways to improve the RMP program, specifically making compliance easier. Who's eligible for RMP? How can we simplify the RMP submission process? Should RMP submissions be certified by a senior official, say senior safety officer, CEO, etc.? Should RMP be a 3, 2, or single-tiered program? I'll go a little bit more into that on the next slide. Are the program elements clearly defined? And are all terms and definitions sufficiently clear? So what do these changes mean for your facility? Increased federal oversight for facilities. They've talked about it a few times where they want to increase federal cooperation and synchronization of these federal requirements, and also go ahead and bring a little bit more attention to some facilities. Increased focus on engineering controls to improve safety. Also making sure new technologies and chemicals are in place to remove these hazards. There is a federal interest in the safety case, and interest in facility feedback on simplifying program requirements in order to increase compliance with the program. This ties a little bit back towards OSHA, where Steve had talked about, basically by simplifying the requirements and taking out some of the retail exemptions. You're looking at, I think there are currently about 5,400 program 2s, and out of those, about 4,000 of them are like a fertilizer or some sort of ag business that does take the retail exemption. So if you remove that, you're looking at about 1,400 facilities. With those, 70-something% are public, like water or sewage treatment. So if you remove those 2 exemptions that have been claimed to PSM, they would be Program 3. That leaves about 200 facilities that would be under the Program 2 category. Would it be easy just to go ahead and remove Program 2 altogether and just have Program 1 or Program 3? Or should it just be like OSHA, you either are eligible or you're not? So with that, I'll bring up commenting on the EPA RMP RFI. It was released, like as Steve said, on July 31st. It's got a 90-day comment period, which means October 29th, 2014, comments will be due. Comments are preferred via the regulations.gov. The docket number is listed below, and you can go ahead and look at what other people's previous comments are and review them there. Comments may also be mailed or hand-delivered to the EPA. And with that, I'm going to open it up to general questions and bring Steve up.
I guess first thing I've got a question, is the mic working? Okay, good. All right. Yes, thank you, Jordan. Nice job. My name's Steve Maher again, and the first thing I'd like to do is thank everybody in attendance. Appreciate your joining our webinar today. I know everybody's super busy. Most of the people who are tuned in have direct responsibilities for process safety. I just want to emphasize your job is very important, or even if it's one of the most thankless jobs at your facility, it's super important, and it really does make a difference. And also, anyhow, so thank you for attending. I would also like to thank our producers, Michael Vigliarolo and also Tim Lee, for pulling all this stuff together. There's a lot of, to get a webinar like this going, there's a lot of stuff that has to go on in the background. We're opening up for question and answer, and again, just go ahead and use your question window. I'm going to ask the producer to go ahead and identify the question. I'll try to repeat it, and then we'll go ahead and try to provide as succinct and useful answer as possible. But before we get into that, let me also emphasize the importance of following these regulations that are evolving. If you're in process safety to stay, you will have to deal with this sooner or later. You really want to follow what's happening with the different evolving requirements as they're modernizing the programs. I'd encourage you to really go back through and get back and provide feedback on the request for information. So anyhow, with all that said, do we have some questions?
Yes, Brandy Davis asks, based on the RFI submitted by OSHA and EPA, it looks like they are starting to deviate from each other. Typically, OSHA and EPA have been called twin sister regulations. OSHA RFI is more technical in nature than the EPA's. Do you see them getting further apart in the future?
That's a great question. Jordan, you mind if I start?
Go ahead.
All right. The Executive Order 13650 was designed. Thank you. And also, Tim, just you don't need to mention the name. We'll let them do this anonymously. All right. So yeah, the question was that there's some observations that the EPA's and OSHA's RFI are starting to digress. And do we see that digression continue or convergence? And how is that going to play out in terms of the final regulations? Obviously, let me talk about timelines. I was doing some speaking, and we did an exhibit booth on the Global Congress on Process Safety in New Orleans this year. It was in New Orleans, and EPA and OSHA were on podium and asked about timelines. These things are going to take several years to roll out. The regulatory process that's used involves putting out the proposed regulations, getting feedback, issuing a draft, getting feedback, and then finally going for final regulations. And there may be a step or two missing that I'm not familiar with. So this is going to go on for a while. I do agree. I do see a digression in the way the RFI is structured. The EPA's RFI is more of a requesting a lot of background information associated with what people are doing at their plant sites. It's not just a direct commentary on their proposed regulations. So that in itself is a bit different. Some of the individual elements, as Jordan mentioned, are a bit different. And also the EPA, the timing is later, and it's springboarding on a lot of things that have come up between when OSHA originally formulated its RFI and the current one associated with safety cases. So as you saw from some of my slides before, we've got parallel agencies, at least 5 major ones for refineries in California, which is where we're basically ground zero for how they're looking at refinery safety. You got 5 different agencies or groups of agencies, and one of the groups of agencies has over a dozen member agencies all looking at that. So you're going to see a lot of divergence. As time moves forward, one agency is going to say, oh, maybe that's a good idea. So there's almost a one-upsmanship going on here too. So that's where we're at. It is in a constant state of flux. I do think that based on Executive Order 13650 and also just basic common sense, that people are going to have to realize that preventing accidents, the core parts that you mentioned in prevention programs in the RMP and also the framework for process safety management are what's going to keep workers at the plant site safe, which is OSHA's objective, and the community and the environment safe, which is what the EPA's objective. That core ability and the same driving forces for why the different regulatory involvements evolved into basically the same endpoint, which is what we've got today, I think is going to force a convergence as time moves forth and these regulations get finalized. Recognize that there's going to be several years for this to come together.
Yeah, and with that too, I'd also just like to say, we're just looking at the changes. Obviously, everything is still going to stay intact from RMP and PSM. So there will be quite a bit of overlap still. It's just a few minor changes where EPA is kind of trying to make sure that they're looking at their core competency, which is the environment and the public, and OSHA is still just looking at the worker safety aspect.
Excellent. Good question. Tim, next.
Yeah, so in reference to the last slide, can I assume that the EPA will take comments on modifying or clarifying the definitions of receptors and the guidelines for determining nearly industrial areas where there are no buildings as receptors?
With that, I would say probably it would actually be better to go ahead and... basically what they were asking was, should you go ahead and comment, they were asking about, say, defining receptors in the EPA, RMP, RFI, or should they just go ahead and do something else? I would suggest probably going ahead and trying to get in touch with your local EPA representatives and make sure that you can get some clarification from them. But it definitely wouldn't hurt. They are looking to make sure that they have updated the RMP process as much as possible. And they are also looking for some general comments with regards to what they call the Streamlining RMP Requirements. So I'd say that focusing at that number 12 that I talked about, Streamlining RMP Requirements, would be a good way to do it.
Just to add to that, I think it's an emphatic yes. Anything that you have to say with respect to how the process is being played out, regulatory applicability, even general issues, I'm sure will represent good fodder to the EPA. These are things they need to hear from industry. The worst thing industry could do right now would be just to go ahead and say, okay, you guys work it out and let us know what you want to do. They need your feedback. If you're working at a plant site and you're working day to day with the equipment or around the chemical processes, whatever, it's second nature to you. It's not second nature to the regulators who are sitting in an office in Washington, D.C. and who really need feedback from folks, boots on the ground out in the field.
Next question, would failure to conduct a 5-year mechanical integrity audit by an independent third-party consultant be considered by OSHA to be a violation?
Independent third-party audit. Under the current framework, I don't think so.
No, it's not currently required.
Oh, I would repeat the question. Okay, currently, if there's a failure to perform a 5-year mechanical integrity audit, would that be considered a violation by OSHA? Let me try to fill in the blanks, and I'm going to ask by the way, over at Risk Management Professionals, it's not just Jordan and me. I've got a number of other folks in the room who are going to be my lifeline for questions, just to make sure that I'll step in something. Okay, so basically the compliance audit requirements in general are triennial, every 3 years. For ammonia facilities, there's also an industry guideline for B109 audits, which is a little bit more focused on mechanical integrity. So those are out there currently, but there's not a requirement to do things third party. If you've got expertise on site and can justify it, then you're able to do your own audits. What's being proposed by OSHA and by EPA, and this is something Risk Management Professionals provide some comments on in the OSHA's RFI, the proposal is to do independent third-party audits. Where that's coming from is the SEMS regulations that came out recently for offshore facilities in federal waters of the United States were requiring independent auditors. So the EPA and OSHA are going like, hey, does that work for us too? Well, there's a difference in environment. Offshore facilities, a lot of them are run by small crews, contractors. A lot of onshore facilities, you got more resources. So currently there is no requirement for an independent third-party audit for onshore facilities, either by EPA or OSHA. One of the feedback we provided to OSHA is that you shouldn't negate if a company has the ability to justify that they can do a good job and as an independent auditor, well, maybe they've got the best expertise at the plant site. So why would you get somebody coming in from the outside who may not understand the facility, the organization? And if you need a separate set of eyes, that's fine, but it's not something that should be absolutely required if you can justify you got the experience on site. So, Jordan, did you have something to add?
No, I'd say that captures it.
Guys out there, did I hit that target okay? All right, very good. Okay, next.
We are a few months post OSHA's deadline for RFI. Most facilities that do PSM are covered under RMP. Have you had any insight as to the overall message from industry on the changes to PSM, in favor or not? I suspect this will carry over into EPA's proposals. Okay, that's a good question. So the point that was being made was that we're a couple months after the RFI deadline for OSHA. It noted that there was quite a bit of overlap between PSM and RMP, and will some of those comments be carried into the EPA's process? This kind of feeds back to the overall question earlier of convergence. The regulatory process involves several iterations, and the evolution, the same driving forces that evolved a common endpoint that we've got with the current regulations today are going to result in some convergence. What I'd like to see, and another part of the question was, is industry embracing a lot of these changes? I think that everybody, by the way, Risk Management Professionals as a consulting firm, we're called on to do really high quality work, so the people who call upon us really want to work with us and they really want to get good safety programs. Invariably, the people that we work with want to do good things to protect their employees, the community, and the environment if it makes sense and if it's cost effective. Okay, when I say cost effective, resource effective.
if they're doing something that they feel has tangible benefits, they're all for it. And so I think that industry will welcome things that make sense, that have a tangible benefit in terms of safety, but I think there's a lot of things that may have won't get quite as much bang for the buck, if you may, in terms of the effort put forth. And one of the problems is that if you put a lot of effort into portions of your program that don't have a lot of benefit, something's got to give. Somewhere along the line you might miss an important thing that would have been picked up if it were a streamlined program. So I think in general industry would welcomes things that are very good benefit for the kind of effort that you put in, and are really focused on things that have tangible benefits to safety.
And kind of like you said, if you want to see more specific industry responses, you can look at, on the Federal Register, they have all the comments from OSHA's RFI period. Also the executive order, they went around the country looking at EPA, OSHA, Department of Transportation, TSA, everyone kind of looked around. And so they also took some comments, had questions and answer sessions, and transcripts from those are also available online. So I would suggest taking a look there if you want a little bit more specific information.
Great. Next.
Which regulatory change do you think will have the biggest impact on industry?
The question was, which regulatory change do we think would have the biggest impact on industry? Obviously, it's speculative. A lot of these things can have a lot of impact. But for me, one of the key things could be safety cases. That's something that's kind of you didn't see it in the OSHA's RFI. You are starting to see it in the CSB's regulatory report, and the EPA is picking up on it. And also the California Interagency Working Group is picking up on it. Safety cases don't need to be that complicated. It's really a matter of making a case for safety. It usually involves a core of management systems that are directly analogous, and basically it can be, for all practical purposes, PSM. Added on to that is some additional things, as Jordan mentioned, that allow you to validate that it's as low as reasonably practicable with respect to controlling safety at the plant site. So there's a little bit more quantitative risk assessment, a little deeper dive into consequence analysis, and correlation to industry acceptance thresholds with respect to risk. So there can be a lot there, but it's really kind of an adder to the management systems that you've already got in place. The concern would be that that's a way to approach safety cases that make sense. They can also be blown way out of proportion. You could spend lifetimes doing these kinds of analyses. We do a lot of the quantitative risk assessment stuff, and you can put incredible amounts of energy and effort into it just to calculate some numbers. The question is, does that really have tangible benefits? It can turn into a numbers game. It can also turn into a war of consultants. You've got one consultant who has expertise in these QRA areas that puts out a report, and then somebody else has to hire another consultant to comment on that report and review it. And really, to me, this is one area that could detract from efforts that you might put into managing safety at the plant site, and it could turn into a game of consultants where you just dump a lot of money into it. So it's one of those things that I think that we should watch very carefully. These are things that we're also, I've personally been around for a while and used to do a lot of risk management and prevention programs in California. These are things that are pretty closely analogous to what a current safety case might be. And one of the problems with the program is it could get very theoretical, and people spend a lot of money on consultants, and you really have to be careful to keep the efforts focused. So that's one area I would monitor carefully and could get a bit problematic with respect to regulatory activity and enforcement. Tim?
Next question. This is with respect to a specific slide on the innovation. On a high-risk list showing the NAICS numbers that the presenter showed, water supply and irrigation systems are included. What changes would be required of a system using chlorine gas and hydrous ammonia? These chemicals are being used for disinfecting water.
With that, it would basically be, chances are your chlorine, they were asking for chlorine facilities. Water irrigation is listed under the Program 3 NAICS codes they proposed. What would those potential impacts be? chances are with chlorine, that's actually the rare one where EPA actually has a lower threshold quantity than PSM. So that chlorine, chances are, probably already is a program 3. However, potentially your ammonia system, depending on if you use aqueous versus anhydrous, you could be looking at an issue where you're bumping that program also up to a program 3. And EPA really is proposing those numbers currently more as a talking point, saying, hey, you know, should we look at a way of potentially updating these NAICS codes for the most incidents and say by the number of incidents, severity of incidents, how should we determine which those 9, 10, 11, however many codes they decide to land on, which ones should be automatically program 3?
Next.
Our process is towards the bottom edge of PSM RMP requirements. We use propane in a process. Our max volume is 60,000 pounds, 18,000 gallons. How do you think these changes might affect our process differently from larger processes?
I don't know. Would there any of the changes that are being proposed really affect them very much?
Okay. Yeah, the question was that if a facility is kind of towards the smaller facility, how do these impact smaller facilities versus larger facilities, essentially? Theirs was they have propane on site, so they were curious what the effects of these would be versus other facilities.
Yeah, I guess my response is that there'd really be no real difference in terms of the impact on these additional elements for the facilities that fall into the category where they're going to have to do them. For example, if you've got a multi-unit refinery, obviously you've got a lot of effort to apply all the proposed changes. If you've got a smaller facility, if you're above the threshold quantity and these things do apply to you, then you're basically going to have to apply them, the same sort of things at the scale of your facility. So I think you can't really ignore various elements if they say, hey, you have to look at human factors. You have to look at atmospheric monitoring systems and some sort of automatic activation. You really have to apply those things during your PHA.
Did you find a lack of interest in RAGAGEPs from EPA RFI interesting?
Okay. The question was, did we find a lack of interest in RAGAGEPs in the EPA RFI interesting?
I
didn't see a lack of interest. I guess I saw the same sort of interest in making sure they're addressed as part of OSHA. So the EPA is raising a lot of other points, but this is still something I see a parallelism and a convergence between OSHA and the EPA.
Yeah, I think the disconnect is coming from, basically we proposed some of the things that the EPA and OSHA are aligned on. We just briefly skimmed through those because we already presented on it, and the information is made available via the website Steve talked about earlier. But yeah, they still do parallel with OSHA PSM on some changes and updates to RAGAGEP with regards to the EPA RMP RFI.
Next question is LOPA currently required for RMP submittals to the EPA?
Okay, the question is LOPA currently required for RMP submittals to the EPA? LOPA is layer protection analysis. It's basically another tool in the toolkit for doing process hazard analysis, and there's no direct requirements for doing it. It's the sort of thing that we use to supplement the insights that you might get from a HAZOP study. And it can be, well, it's one of those tools that can be way over applied if it's not done carefully. We find that it's best applied when you're trying to get additional insights for the scenarios in the HAZOP study, or when you're trying to use it to define the safety integrity levels needed for safety instrumented systems. When you're designing a new facility, those high-end safety systems, what level of reliability do you need? So there are very good applications for layer protection analysis. There's a lot of fear out there because some people have over-applied it. If you apply it with the right balance for your overall PHA toolkit, you're in good shape. Next question.
It seems like the regulatory bodies are having a hard time keeping up with their current requirements. Is this going to be more difficult with additional and potentially more complicated regulations?
The question is, it seems like currently the regulatory bodies are having a hard time keeping up with enforcement and their supervision of facilities. Is this going to be even more difficult for them? Obviously, it's speculative. There have been some criticisms in the CSB's regulatory report in terms of the regulatory oversight and the overall control points for California refineries. When you look at the interagency working group and what the other agencies are coming up with, all of them are identifying they need additional funding for technical resources, training, and making sure they've got enough people to do it. I think it's still going to it's going to be a constant challenge. But what I'd like to see for the regulations as they're being updated is to make sure they're focused on the simple things that have a really good impact. If you make these things too complicated, add too many additional new elements, you're going to have an environment where only the consultants have the resources to deal with it. And the only reason they've got the resources is that they're basically being paid for by industry. So you're really going down a path where it could be very, very problematic if you make the regulations too complicated. And yeah, the regulators are going to have a rough time keeping up if they make it too complicated. So what I'd like to see is a balance and an ability to have things that are sensible and provide the kind of impact at the plant sites that you want. Jordan?
And with regards to that, you also do, I guess to bring it back to the question first, yeah, you know, if we increase what they're doing and they don't increase their resources, it will be more difficult just because there is more work with no additional workforce. However, they have, case in point with safety case, looked at, hey, you know, we're going to need additional budget. What would be the additional costs associated with making this change? And with all of the topics, they usually were conscious of what the cost versus what the benefit would be, and then they would respond likewise.
Yeah, and all these are good fodder for feedback to the EPA as part of the RFI, even if it doesn't fit into one of the specific questions they're asking. General feedback in terms of regulatory complexity and the ability to effectively implement them at the plant site and supervise them from a regulatory perspective is certainly fair feedback. Tim, other questions?
Will the EPA provide money to help offset the cost of switching to a safer chemical, switching from gas chlorine to liquid chlorine?
Okay, good question. Will the EPA provide funding for switching to an inherently safer chemical, such as going from gaseous chlorine to what some people call liquid chlorine or sodium hypochlorite, something to help chlorinate the water and disinfect it? It's a great idea, but I don't think I've ever heard of any program where the EPA is providing funding for that. Jordan, anybody?
I've never heard of it. I mean, maybe look around and see if there's some grant money from something, but I've never heard of it.
Yeah, and in fact, another part of that question, we've worked with a lot of water treatment facilities that use very large quantities of chlorine gas for disinfection. We've worked with smaller ones. The high users, chlorine really, if it's controlled properly, is a very effective disinfectant, and it can be managed safely. The challenge is, obviously, the consequences of release are a lot more than if you're using sodium hypochlorite or some sort of liquid solution. So people are, most of the conversions that people have been making really have been looking for that balance in terms of, hey, how much chlorine do I use? How much disinfectant do I use versus the cost of regulatory programs? Obviously, if you go to sodium hypochlorite, basically your pool chlorinator, these are things that are going to be less regulatory intensive, so you can save a lot of money on your regulatory programs, even though you're spending a lot more money buying a liquid solution that's mostly water. Tim?
That's it for questions.
All right, that sounds like all the questions. What I would like to do is two things. Number one, again, thank everybody. We've also got a lot of resources on our website, especially the regulatory update page, where you can download all these regulations. We're going to try to keep it up to date as these things move forward. Separately, all our webinars page, all these webinars are recorded and they're available for download. This one will probably be ready in about a week or so after we package it all up so that people can download it very easily. We've provided links to that regulatory updates page and the webinars page, and there's also a specific webinar where we've tried to share our experiences with safety cases, and we provided a webinar for safety cases as part of our SEMS series. For webinars, we have a SEMS series, we got a HAZUP series, and we got a number of other topical areas that hopefully you'll find very useful. And we also do seminars. We've got one planned for the September-November timeframe up in northern, I think two maybe, one in Northern California, one in Central California. those workshops can be very helpful if you want to send folks over there for some hands-on, and as well as getting information like this forum, some interaction with other people who are addressing the same issues. So anyhow, lots of information out there. I hope this webinar was helpful. And again, thank you for your attendance.